I open every episode of Tatooine Sons with the statement, we believe that pop culture is the mythology of our generation. There's a story written on our souls and that these myths speak to that story. Well, our guest today believes this so much, he's convinced that the Force can fix the world.
It's true. All of it.
What is the name of the porg on the Millennium Falcon?
Force is strong in my family.
What do you think his name is? It's a big moment.
I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
Maybe Turbis?
Do or do not. There is no try.
Turbis? Pablo, if you're listening to this live stream, that porg's name is now Turbis. It's a good Star Wars name.
We're not done yet.
These guys recorded an awesome podcast called Tatooine Sons. Everybody listen to it.
Welcome to Tatooine Sons, the only fan podcast to name an official Star Wars creature and be endorsed by the writer-director of The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson. And yes, we love that movie and we love Ryan. I know I just said it, but it is important for me to say it again. We believe that pop culture is the mythology of this generation. There is a story written on our souls and that these myths speak to that story. And that is why I'm honored to be joined on this first episode of our new interview series by Stephen Kent, the author of the book, How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. Stephen is a communications and public relations professional. He regularly appears on Fox News and Fox Business and CNN and C-SPAN and the Glenn Beck Show and BlazeTV and SiriusXM's POTUS Channel. Stephen hosts Right Now, which is a conservative and kind of libertarian YouTube show on the Rightly Network. And if you're a Star Wars fan, you may know him from something completely different. He's also the host of the very popular Star Wars and Politics podcast, Beltway Banthas. Stephen is one of the most interesting voices in the Star Wars fan community. And I was honored to spend a few minutes with him recently discussing his new book. And one of the questions I was compelled to ask him was why the major themes in a space fantasy serial are so relevant in our world today.
Well, the real world is always changing, and the issues that sort of connect with people in any given time are always going to change. But there's something about, particularly Star Wars, where it is drawing on so many different cultures from across history and across the world that it's sort of impossible not to always graft whatever you're experiencing in your real life onto the ideas of Star Wars. The Way of the Jedi is both sort of a hybrid of Greek Stoicism with Buddhism. It also draws from certain elements of the Christian tale, particularly like Star Wars story beats draws more from the Christian tale than the morality of the Jedi. But this whole idea that the world is always trending towards excess, towards darkness, that we're always grappling on the combat between chaos and order, and then trying to make ethical trade-offs between freedom and security to try to have the lives that we want to live. These things are just going to always be timeless. And that is why Star Wars just continues to connect across the world, no matter where you are.
You, touch on some, big idea topics in your chapters, hope and empathy and redemption and humility and all these. In your opinion, which chapter is the most important?
I think the chapter on fear is the most important, particularly because in the Star Wars, canon, the Star Wars story, fear is sort of the introduction of the path to darkness and suffering. So Yoda says to Anakin in episode 1, I sense much fear in you. And then Anakin's like, what does that matter? And he says, completely matters, everything. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. And if you take that seriously and you can kind of look in the news and look in your own life for where fear is sort of the pathway to these different forms of decline, like right now, I'm reading my way through the Dune novel right now in anticipation of the new movie coming out in October. And, that entire story is also based around the idea of like fear is the mind killer. And I think that we live in a society and in a time where we have the most security, the most prosperity, the least amount of reasons, and I mean this seriously, to be afraid for our lives, even in the midst of a viral pandemic of which we have vaccines, medicines, and modern techniques to try to curb that kind of illness. We live in a really great time to be alive, and yet people are just more frightened, stressed out, terrified, and under the belief that they're in mortal danger at all times than I have just ever seen. You see it in our media complex. You see it in our foreign policy establishment. You see it in the way that the Pentagon spends and builds battleships and new fighters and is always asking for a higher budget as if we are in times of war and chaos, when in fact we are in relative times of peace. From the way that we parent our kids to not wanting them to be outside of our sight and roam neighborhoods like they might have back in the 80s or the early 90s. We have this trend called helicopter parenting, where we're keeping our eyes on our children and mandating certain sorts of closeness to the family at all time in a way that is just really unnatural and frankly uncalled for. We're kind of increasingly paranoid people, and particularly in a time where we're dealing with a viral pandemic, that fear has incredible consequences for our liberties and the role of government. Look no further than Australia and how they have dealt with the coronavirus by really stripping their people of their civil liberties across the country and being incredibly heavy-handed for a virus which just has not claimed that many lives on net in the continent of Australia. So there's just lots to chew on. But I think fear is, of course, the most relevant one. And Star Wars cares the most about fear being eliminated from the hearts of its characters, lest they fall to darkness.
Does it feel sometimes in our world that fear is more than just a reaction to the events that we're facing, but also a tool that's being used to promote agendas? And we have to find that balance that, is talked about so much in Star Wars between understanding the reality of the world that we live in, but not being controlled by that fear.
Absolutely. So in the chapter on fear, I mentioned that there is a particular kind of creature that roams the galaxy, roams our country, that knows your fear, understands your fear, and seeks to prey and capitalize on your fear for their own personal benefit. That creature is, of course, the politician. And, politicians don't go out and take the stump, right? Like speak to people and tell them that they don't have much to be afraid of. They go out and they just try to double down on everything that you might be concerned about, your economic anxieties, gun violence, crime, economic stuff. I mean, one of the members of the squad, Priya Paul, she was talking on Twitter the other day about how the United States has the 4th highest poverty rate in the world. It's objectively untrue. We're not even the top 10 for that kind of thing. And you have to wonder why. I mean, you're doing that to stoke certain amounts of fear, anxiety, resentment in your following so that then they will sign off on whatever it is that you would like them to do. You hear politicians talk about this when it comes to gun violence and mass shootings. Like, mass shootings are incredibly scary. Gun violence is incredibly scary. And yet we still live in one of the most peaceful times in United States history, particularly for the past 30, 40 years, with the exception of the last 12 months, right? And that's not connected to the specter of mass shootings, the idea that you're going to be struck down in a mall by some sort of psycho. It's an incredibly fringe sort of an event that happens. It's like lightning strikes sort of events. But what we have experienced in the past year because of coronavirus and unemployment is a surge in the murder rate across the country. So we are seeing one of the highest spikes in the murder rate that we've experienced in 20 years in this country, just as a pure matter of economics. So yeah, I mean, there are people in our world and creatures who feed on fear. Politicians are only able to feed off of those things. Can you imagine a politician like standing up in front of everybody and saying, everything that all you voters are telling me about today, everything that you've expressed to me, I got to tell you, you should really count your blessings. We've never been in a more peaceful time in human history. You should be grateful. They would never do that. They're never going to do that. The entire incentive structure of politics is based around telling the people that all of their concerns, fears, and anxieties are warranted and actually somewhat virtuous. And that's how they secure power. It's not about you. It's about them.
We've come a long way from FDR's the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, haven't we?
Yeah, we sure have. Fear today is considered to be a virtue in and of its own self. When you hear politicians and activists talk about the individualized experiences of people, right? Like whether or not it is, you've experienced racism in your life or you've experienced some sort of economic catastrophe, you've gotten sick, that sort of everybody has to listen to you and sort of validate your opinions on the world based on experiences that you've had as an individual. And while individualism matters and individual experience does matter and brings color and context to the world in which we live in, it is not the case that we should be guided by the individual experiences and whims of people all around the country. Just because they saw or experienced a certain thing doesn't make them an expert. And it also doesn't mean that the thing that they're talking about is a widespread trend. And so one of the things I talk about in my book, because I think Star Wars should offer us ways in which we should, actually change the way that we live, is, being smarter about whether or not what we're consuming in our media diets or what we're seeing on social media is actually an outlier sort of an event, or if it is part of a larger trend. If the things that we're seeing are just sort of fringe, crazy events that rarely happen, but the media are spinning it off as the new normal, or if the thing that we're seeing is actually something that's picking up in frequency and we should be relatively concerned about.
We live in a weird, scary world for our kids to be growing up in. You mentioned earlier in the 80s when you and I were kids, 80s and 90s, we'd leave in the morning on our bicycles and come home after dark. And our parents really didn't worry that much about what was going to happen. And now we have this helicopter parenting thing, and our kids are inundated with all of these fear-based messages, or at least they pick up on them all around that. How do you use, Star Wars to help, as a dad with your children?
Well, I was just watching Star Wars Rebels the other week with my daughter, and it was the episode where Ezra Bridger is working through some of his fears with his master Kanan Jarrus, and they're really butting heads. They're not getting along, and it's because Ezra has been dwelling a great deal on the idea that his crew in Star Wars Rebels might abandon him at some point. He's starting to have sort of bad dreams about them not caring about him, or saying one thing to his face and another behind his back. And he starts lashing out in anger towards Kanan over this sort of paranoia that he generally has as an orphan who lost his parents and sort of lived on the streets, of being alone again. And Kanan sits down with him in, I can't remember what planet, but it was like in this abandoned hangar bay where they're surrounded by all these dark dwelling monsters who are basically closing in on them unless they have light to shine in their direction to scare them away. And Kanan's talking to him about the importance of saying what it is he's actually afraid of. He's not just like lashing out at Kanan in anger for no reason. He's afraid of a thing, but he doesn't know how to name that certain thing. And so Kanan yells at him. He pushes him. He's just like, say it. Say what you're afraid of. And he gets Ezra to say, I'm afraid of being alone. And that's the underlying pain of Ezra Bridger, just being able to name it, recognize it, and understand that that's his complex. That's a huge step forward in being able to actually conquer, your fear and subdue some of your angers and anxieties that you might have about the world. You said, understandably that like it's a scary time to be a kid these days. It's not. It's actually a really good time to be a kid. And one of the main things that we worry about in the world today, and as parents particularly, and I mentioned like the helicopter parenting thing, is we came up in the late 80s in the peak of the serial killer phenomenon. So serial killers were sort of on the prowl from the 1970s to mid 1980s. And it peaked in 1989, the year that I was born. And every subsequent year, we have basically kind of seen like the serial killer in the old sense really be relegated to the dustbin of history for a lot of different reasons that we can kind of get into. But that is the reason why we have so many states across the country where it is actually against the law to have your children outside of your sight, even in their own neighborhood. There are only 3 states in the country that have these things called free-range parenting laws, which protect the right of a parent to let their kid out of their sight in their community and not face legal action by the state or possibly have their parental rights taken away from them. These things didn't come out of nowhere, and they were absolutely born out of a paranoia that's no longer connected with reality. Same thing goes for economic anxiety, but eco anxiety. There's a ton of stories circulating the internet right now about how young kids are dealing with anxiety about climate change and the state of the world, right? So like the actual physical world. And I appreciate why that might be the case. There's a lot of conversation in the mainstream media and in celebrity culture about climate change. But you should really pause and ask yourself if your child is panicking and worried and dealing with actual anxiety about climate change. Is it because you have told them that they should be afraid and that any day they're going to be drowned or taken under the sea by a changing climate? Or is it because they are just watching the news and coming up with their own apocalyptic visions of what the future is going to be like? And I would argue that in almost every case, it is because they are being told that the world is going to end in 10 years and told by their parents and by media figures and by celebrities that the world is not going to be around in 20 years the way that it is today. Whether or not you believe that's true, I don't think it's the case that eco-anxiety among children is natural. I think it is being foisted upon them, and that's our own failing.
It's so important to remember that in a world where information is bombarding us 24/7, that we have to protect our minds and those of our kids especially from this constant fear-mongering that ultimately leads to anger and hatred and suffering. My interview with Stephen will continue in just a moment, but I want to take a minute here just to thank our sponsor, Cufflinks.com. It's early November, so maybe you're experiencing this too. My wife, Christy, and then, of course, Samuel the Hutt and BB Nate, they're already starting to ask about what to get me for Christmas. I usually settle for like a gift card or something like that. But this year, I'm going to be sure to take a look at everything available at Cufflinks.com. Cufflinks.com has over 3,000 items for the sharp-dressed fan, including cufflinks, ties, tie bars, and socks from all of the fandoms that you love, like Star Wars and Star Trek and Marvel and DC and Lord of the Rings and a whole bunch of others. We love Cufflinks.com because they're family-owned and run by a couple of brothers who geek out about Star Wars as much as we do. So if you want to help the show out and look great doing it, head on over to Cufflinks.com and get your Christmas list together. And then be sure to tell your family to use the code Tatooine15 at checkout to receive 15% off of your entire order. And, now that I think about it, I wouldn't be surprised if Steven has some cufflinks or ties or something like that from Cufflinks.com to wear on CNN or Fox News when he appears. He always looks amazing. The opening chapter of How the Force Can Fix the World is entitled A Child Queen and a World Divided. And it focuses on the importance of humility. I asked Steven why he chose to start with that principle.
Well, because a lot of my book is kind of trying to go back and draw on timeless virtues and stories. And, one story that stuck out to me was in the book of Matthew in the Bible. And this is just something from my childhood and upbringing that always stuck out to me, is Jesus speaking to his disciples and basically telling them to go out into the world and to be like children, to have the minds of children, to share the gospel and tell people about the good news that is Christ and redemption in God. And I find that to be really interesting. Why would you want people to have or to think as if they are children? And a lot of people look at that and they go, are you telling people that they should be naive, that they should be kind of careless? The verse in Matthew 8 goes, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And I've talked to Christians before and skeptics, and they're like, I don't know how I feel about thinking like a child. But the idea of thinking like a child is knowing that you need a savior. It's knowing that every single day when you wake up and go through life, you're kind of dependent on others. You need your parents to provide for you, feed you, take care of you, provide you room and board. You need others. And children have an acute sense of that because of their condition. Adults, we eventually all lose sight of the fact that we need others to survive. We rely on our own strength, our own understanding, our work, our knowledge, our skills. And I was watching Star Wars Episode 1 and observing how Padme dealt with the droid invasion of Naboo. And I just thought it was really cool that this kid is 14 years old and manages to deal with an illegal occupation and invasion of her home world, and that she manages to go to the Senate, realizes that it's a broken process and that she's going to have to take matters into her own hands. And instead of just arming up and going to try to take on the droids herself, she goes to the sworn rivals and enemies of the people of the Naboo, which are the Gungans who live under the sea. These two warring tribes and factions do not get along in the slightest. They're completely estranged from one another for reasons which have basically been alluded and tied to sort of the same story of like Pilgrims and Native Americans, right? So that the human population coming in and pushing the Gungans out of the land and into the water. It's a story of great tension. But Padme knows that she's going to need help. And she's able to, even at her very young age, not knowing what she doesn't know, that she's going to try to need to find a new ally. And I saw that and I just connected the dots and was like, holy cow, there's a great deal of wisdom in our children to know when they need to ask for help, to kneel before someone like Boss Nass and say, my fate is in your hands. Will you help us? That's a huge step forward, especially for adults who tend to be a little bit arrogant, tend to be a little bit set in their ways in whatever way that might be, and aren't willing to reach on their fellow neighbor or even to an enemy out for help.
One of the reasons that we are so reluctant to reach out to others is also because we tend to put people in different categories and camps. And if they disagree with us politically, on social issues, on religious issues or anything, we tend to lump them all together and divide as a result of that. So then it's exactly what you were talking about with the Naboo and the Gungans. They were divided based on their people groups instead of seeing each other as being able to work together. And you talk a lot about that in this idea of masks in the book. Why are we more comfortable seeing those that are different than us, and especially our enemies, as these masked villains rather than human beings?
Because it's easy, Complexity is hard. Complexity is exhausting. And empathy is something that we as people are only able to really carry and live in when we already have our basic needs met, when we are free of anxiety, when we're free of things that we're worried about or striving for. That's when people are typically the most able to then turn to the needs of their neighbors, and particularly that of strangers, and help them and see them. I talk a little bit about just like how we deal with homelessness and the needy in our own lives. It takes a special kind of person to when they are struggling to pay their bills, spend a morning every week at the soup kitchen feeding the poor. In my own experience working in soup kitchens, it tended to be the case. And I just remember this a lot. Like the people who I ended up working with who were from my church or from my scout troop, they were always the most well-off people, the people who went out to go serve. And that's not necessarily a value statement on them, just to say is like, they have less to worry about. Therefore, they have more time, more heart and energy to give. I think if you live particularly in the Christian faith, there's a calling on you to always give more regardless. And I think that that's good. But we live in a time where those sorts of values, and particularly membership in the Christian faith, are in huge amounts of decline. And we're going to see a more self-centered culture as a result. The Star Wars lesson that I ended up zeroing in on for that chapter on empathy was actually just a very simple line, again, from the Phantom Menace, when Qui-Gon is talking to Obi-Wan about a disturbance in the Force. And Qui-Gon asks Obi-Wan to keep his mind here and now where it belongs, to focus on the present. And Obi-Wan says, but, Master Yoda said I should be mindful of the future. And Qui-Gon responds, not at the expense of the moment. And that's powerful. Like that actually is a really good tip for people on how they should be thinking about managing their own lives. And it matters if you are present, if you are focusing on what it is you are doing at the moment. That's the kind of thing that's going to allow you to connect with someone who's begging on the side of the street for a little bit of change rather than just breeze right past them and not make eye contact. It's also the same kind of thing that's going to allow you to find the mental and emotional capacity to look past somebody on Twitter who is being incredibly rude and mean to you for whatever political reason, to actually try to see them for who they are versus whatever sort of cartoon you're ascribing to them, whatever sort of mask you are putting on them, like Rey sort of thought of Kylo Ren as a creature in a mask, only to have it be revealed to her that he is in fact a young man, kind of handsome, relatable to her, and it sort of shattered her entire understanding of who this enemy of hers was, because she was there in the moment with nowhere else to go.
You mentioned your faith a lot and sort of connections to the Christian tradition throughout this interview and also throughout the book. And the book really isn't about religion, but obviously your faith is front and center throughout it. How does your faith influence the way that you watch Star Wars?
Well, it's kind of inseparable. That's a good question. And I'm curious where you come at it from yourself. But, when you're raised in the church and you kind of have that understanding of the way that the world is, the way that people should be, it's hard not to sort of see it in all of Star Wars as a story. One of the areas that it sticks out the most to me is particularly the message of letting go and letting God. So this is the area as a Christian where I struggle the absolute most, is to let God's plan be God's plan, to actually listen and try to understand what the will of the Force is, if you will. But we are control freaks as people. I mentioned that whole thing about children knowing that they need help. When Luke has a bad vision of Han and Leia suffering in Cloud City at the hands of the Empire, what does he do? He gets freaked out. He gets whipped up into a frenzy about it. And he gets, he hops on his X-Wing and he flies to Cloud City before his training is complete as a Jedi. And, against the will and advice of both Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, because he just kind of didn't see or accept the possibility that something bad could happen, and he didn't do everything he could do to stop it. Anakin, of course, does the same thing with Padme and his visions of her death. There's no willingness to accept it. You have to try to control it. That's like our human calling, to try to control everything in our own existence and lives. As a Christian, you are called, you are asked to trust and know that God is there for you, that there is a plan, that in your suffering, sometimes there is purpose. If something bad has happened, it is sometimes the case that this was supposed to happen and it's part of God's plan and you're going to grow from it. And perhaps that person who you lost really is in a better place. And perhaps it was part of God's grand plan for you to learn some particularly really hard lesson at a great cost. This is sort of how you put your life together as a Christian and deal with trauma and hardship. And for me, it just kind of all comes down to that moment where Luke is trying to shoot and take out the Death Star, and he puts away his targeting computer. I struggle a great deal as a Christian to not control everything. It's like when I want to go pursue a new job and I'm like, oh, there's a new opportunity on LinkedIn. There's something that I could apply for. I sometimes will put together my entire application and hit send before I've prayed about it, before I've actually taken a step back and gone, Lord, is this something that you want me to do? Is this wise? Is this the plan that you have for me, to leave what I'm doing right now to do this? You're supposed to do that. But instead, we turn on our targeting computers and we try to make the perfect shot the way that we would have it, rather than listening to the Force, rather than listening to God and following them. That's really, really tough. And for me, that's kind of where the central message of Star Wars and faith align.
That's awesome. For you, I ask this question to everybody that we've ever interviewed, and I like to end with it. For you, how does Star Wars inspire hope?
Star Wars inspires hope for me by reminding me that it always comes hand in hand with being afraid and actually being fearful. There's this moment at the end of Star Wars Rogue One where they've got the Death Star plans. The rebels are getting it back to their main ships, right? The blockade runners. And Darth Vader, of course, shows up on the ship. He boards the rebel craft and he shows up at the end of the hallway. It's a horror movie scene. It's scary. There's the breathing, the red lightsaber at the end of the hallway. It's death incarnate. And he is hacking his way through the rebels to get the Death Star plans back. And at the end, there's no survivors. Pretty much they hand the Death Star plans through the door. That one guy gets them and he runs them to Princess Leia. And he hands it to Princess Leia and he says, what is this? Like, what did we just do? A lot of these rebels, they don't even know what it is that they had. And they hand it to Leia and she says, hope. That's what these Death Star plans are. The Death Star plans themselves are hope. Why is that? Why is it that the Death Star plans are hope? It was the first ray of light that they had had in a long time to take out the Empire, to take a blow to this regime. But at the same time, the Death Star plans are a death sentence. To have that in your possession, to have it in your hand, and all those rebels know that very well who died by the hand of Darth Vader just minutes before. It was the reason that they were going to be hunted down and chased to the ends of the galaxy by the Empire. Sometimes our hope for the future is scary. It involves conquering a dragon. The only reason that we sometimes try to conquer challenges or to climb certain mountains is to get to what's on the other side. It's because we believe there is something beyond the dragon, beyond the mountain. There's a new promised land. So I guess for me, it is just remembering that the Death Star plans and hope, it is a reminder that there is a challenge that needs to be met and something that you're going to have to overcome to get to that better place on the other side.
The greatest story ever told talks about fear all the time. Over and over again, the Bible repeats the phrase, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged. And the reason these words are repeated so often is because doing anything of significance is scary. And we will face dangers and challenges and even opposition. Now, in Star Wars, the Force is the solution. But Christians, like us, believe that the help we need comes from something much bigger than that. I want to thank Stephen Kent for being a part of this inaugural episode in our new interview series. Stephen's book, How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away, is available for purchase on Amazon and everywhere else you buy books. Make sure you follow Stephen on social media and you listen to Beltway Banthas, which is a fantastic podcast about politics and Star Wars, and check out all of the other amazing things that he does. To learn more about Stephen, make sure you go to StephenDKent.com. And thanks for listening to Tatooine Sons, a pop culture podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please take a minute to rate and review the show on your podcast app of choice. Make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button on that app so that you get every episode the moment it drops. Our next episode releases on Tuesday, and we will be giving our spoiler review of the latest Marvel movie Eternals and breaking down everything that we can about the trailer for the Book of Boba Fett, and then taking a deeper look at the lessons we can learn from Star Wars Vision's Tatooine Rhapsody. Make sure you're following Tatooine Sons on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and then share this episode with somebody else. It's absolutely the best way that you can help this show grow. I think that's going to do it for today. There's only one thing left to say.
May the Force be with you, always.
This party's over.
I like that Wookiee.
Don't get technical with me.
Joy, please. Yep, yep.